When I first visited Kings Island, I feel like riding the Beast was the most surreal attraction to experience in the park because, I had seen a lot of pictures and videos of Diamondback and Banshee and Mystic Timbers at that time, but Banshee was just the most iconic, so it was pretty crazy seeing it in person and actually getting to ride it. I feel like that's the one of the best feelings of being a coaster enthusiast, when you finally get to a ride and you get to ride it and it's like, wow, it actually exists. That's pretty crazy. I get to add it to my coaster list. That first experience I had with Banshee was in 2018, and I got to get some re-rides in 2021. I'm gonna be honest, this coaster is pretty hard to rank and review because it is iconic and I respect it. And to be completely honest, I think I respect this ride more than I actually enjoy riding it because it was truly a trailblazer for the roller coasters. The setting of this ride is probably one of the best settings for any roller coaster I've ever been on. It's really tucked back down in the Kings Island woods. Unfortunately, with Orion being built, it kind of intrudes upon the Beast's land, but it's not terrible, and it's only for one sliver of the attraction. Most of it is still really back by itself. Even though there aren't really any elements to break down, I'm going to go through this layout anyway. Once you leave the station, you start with a right-hand turn. You go all the way around until you hit the first lift hill, which can be really, really slow. It's my understanding you have to wait for the train ahead of you to clear the second lift, and sometimes because of Kings Island's fantastic dispatch rates, sometimes that can be a while, so you might go up the entire lift going at a snail's pace, which is kind of funny. You also have that voice spelling safety instructions to you, which is pretty interesting. It's the only ride at Kings Island that does that, so that's interesting. Once you reach the top, you hit the first drop, which is actually pretty steep. It does have a trim on it, but from my experience, that trim didn't really affect me at all, which is not the case for a couple of the other trims on this ride. That drop sends you down into a tunnel, which is actually pretty dark in there. And then once you emerge from the tunnel, you hit a left-hand turn, and then you hit another drop. This drop is actually an airtime moment if you're in the back. It's not very strong, obviously, because this ride is pretty old, but it is there, which is really impressive. I don't know if that's because of more recent retracking, but in the back row, or the second to back row, you get a solid floater pop. After that, you come back up and then you hit the right-hand turn. That is where you can have a view of Orion. That straightaway is pretty interesting because at the end of it is a trim, and that trim slams you to a stop. Not literally, but that trim figuratively slams you to a stop. Like, oh my gosh, especially if you're in the back row, you can really feel how much speed you lose. It totally zaps the train of so much energy, which can almost be sort of a relief in relation to roughness on the ride, especially if you're having a bad ride up to that point. Slowing down a little can be pretty relieving. Slowing down a little can be kind of relaxing. Your concerns about getting injured on that ride will be put to rest there. That trim doesn't hit as hard in the front row, which is one of the reasons why that is my favorite spot to ride the Beast. Out of the big 5 roller coasters at Kings Island, the Beast is actually the only ride that I prefer in the front row, which is pretty interesting. So after that trim, you hit a right-hand turn, and then you go straight for a little bit into another tunnel, which turns you left. You turn all the way around till you come out of the tunnel, and then you turn right. And this is the point where you go like all the way down a hill. You go straight, and then at the very bottom of that hill, you bank right, and then you come back up all the way up to the top of the hill until you hit the second lift hill. The second lift hill will go much faster than the first one, especially if you were crawling on the first one. Once you reach the top of that lift, you're going to turn left and then hit another trim. This trim is pretty unique because it almost acts as a holding brake, because if you're in the front row, you can feel how slowly you're going into that drop. And then once the back car releases from that trim brake, you really start accelerating, it's a pretty unique feeling that's specific to the Beast, which is pretty cool, so that's one way to look at it. That's the way I choose to look at it. It's pretty cool. Like, if you put that trim like right before the Rose Bowl, I feel like that would not have been as fun. That would have been really lame. This drop is actually pretty intimidating, even though it's really shallow, because you gain a lot of speed pretty slowly. But when you're at the bottom of that drop, you're absolutely flying. And of course you hit the Rose Bowl, which is pretty intense. It's by far the most forceful part of the attraction. You will get slammed to the right-hand side, which is why I prefer being in the right seat, so you don't slam into someone. You can brace yourself a little bit. But that element is just crazy. It's crazy how forceful it is. It's pretty spectacular. And then it's basically one long right turn. You go around, you take 2 laps around the Rose Bowl. I actually prefer the first one because of the lateral, just feeling that shock for the first time of being pushed to the right. That's super impressive. And then once you come out of the Rose Bowl, you basically just go straight into the brake run. And that is the Beast. One of the longest roller coasters in the world and the longest wooden coaster in the world. It is quite the experience. In terms of roughness, I've had a few different experiences on the Beast. So obviously the smoothest place to ride would be in the front row, but you're going to have to wait for that. So if you don't want to do that, my second favorite place to ride is second to back. Not the very back, second to back. Wheel seats on this ride kind of scare me. I gotta be totally honest. On the 4th of July in 2021, which was my marathon day at Kings Island, I only rode the Beast 4 times. One of those rides was in a middle row because I got assigned to it, and it was a wheel seat. And that ride almost gave me a headache, and it was pretty painful. So having to take a break after a ride on one of the best rides in the park was kind of a bummer. I really didn't want to get a headache on that day either because I really wanted to lap as many coasters as I could. I had to take it easy for like 30 minutes, I want to say. That's something to keep in mind if you are going to buy Fast Lane at Kings Island and try to get as many laps as you can. Do not ride the Beast on a wheel seat. Obviously, the second of back isn't butter smooth, but it's a lot better. And it's definitely rideable. Like I totally could do re-rides on the Beast in the second to back row, so that's a big upside. I definitely would not lap the Beast on a wheel seat. That would not be pleasant. The Beast probably has the coolest name for any roller coaster ever, which is super cool. I love the logo too. I think it's my favorite logo in the park. It's iconic for a reason. It's just spectacular. This whole ride is iconic for a reason. It's truly a legend. I feel really honored to be able to say that I've been on it. My dad actually grew up in the Midwest, and he rode it while he was in high school, and I got to ride the Beast for the first time while I was in high school. So for that reason, I feel a bit of a sentimental connection to the Beast, so I'll always love this ride just for that reason. Plus, Kings Island totally takes care of it. I know they did a giant retracking not that long ago. Unfortunately, my visit was before the retracking, so it wasn't terrible. I mean, obviously, they still took care of it at that point, but, I didn't get to experience the reprofiled elements of the Beast. I did get to ride with the repainted trains, though, so those are pretty cool. The restraints are generic PTC restraints. They're not my favorite, but I've actually learned how to ride with these better. I am right-handed, so I prefer sitting in the left seat with PTC restraints so I can hold it up with my right hand and rest my arm on the seat divider. So it's pretty easy to hold up if you do that, if you're right-handed. But the thing about the Beast is that it doesn't really have airtime, so there's no reason to hold up the restraint. After that, the second drop on the ride, I just kind of let it go, There's no really point in putting in that effort, especially for such a long ride experience. Oh my gosh. Even if you don't hold up the restraint for that one airtime moment, you're not missing out on much. The Beast was not built for airtime. Kings Island has 3 airtime machines for you, so just go hit up one of those right after that. That's no disrespect to the Beast, of course. it obviously wasn't built for airtime. It was built to be a monster of a wooden coaster, which it absolutely succeeds at. It is such a long ride. And at one point in 2018, back when I was scared of roller coasters, I was pretty scared to ride the Beast because it's pretty fast. It goes 60 miles per hour. So when I first rode the Beast, it was actually the fastest roller coaster I'd ever been on at that point. It didn't hold that title for that long, of course, because I later rode Diamondback. 60 miles per hour, that is pretty fast, especially for a wooden coaster. I'd never been on a really old wooden coaster, so I was worried I was going to get beaten up. And because of those kind of rock bottom expectations, I think I walked away liking this ride a lot more than I thought I would. Even in 2021, when I knew what to expect, I thought the Beast wasn't bad in terms of roughness, which is totally cool. I'm really glad that this ride is at Kings Island and not at a Six Flags park, because honestly, I think the Beast is smoother than Apocalypse at Magic Mountain. That park does not take care of that ride at all, and Kings Island takes care of the Beasts. Thank God. As much as I respect the Beast, I do have to rank it 5th in the park, behind the other headliners at Kings Island, being Banshee, Mystic, Orion, and Diamondback. Out of the 5 big coasters at Kings Island, it is the 5th and final coaster for me. That's not really a knock against the Beast. It is competing with roller coasters that are so modern in comparison. My first experience with Banshee was in 2018 during my first visit to Kings Island, and then I got a whole bunch of re-rides on my return visit in 2021, and on both trips I walked away thinking the same thing, that it was the best B&M invert I had ever ridden. The first time I was more confident in that sentiment than the second time, because at that point I had gotten more re-rides on Raptor at Cedar Point, and I liked that ride a lot more than I used to. So I still think Banshee is the best B&M invert that I've been on. I've been on Afterburn and Alpengeist since then, but I still prefer Banshee over all of them. I feel like the layout on Banshee is just brilliant. I love how the loop interlocks with the lift hill, and I love how there's a second loop. I love how it doesn't reach its max speed until it's like 4th or 5th inversion. It's just so well designed, and I love how it's kind of an out and back coaster when you think about it. I just think it's so well done, and I really love when roller coasters thread their own loop. It's visually satisfying, and on ride it's super cool too. The brilliant layout starts off with an awesome whippy drop that twists to the right. It's really good. From my experience, I felt it was more whippy in the right seat, in the far right seat, in both the front and the back rows, but it's still really fun in any seat. But in the right seat, that whip down that drop is the most pronounced. It's super impressive, that drop on Banshee, because usually the drops on B&M inverts are just something that happens that you don't really think about. My home B&M invert is Silver Bullet, and that drop is an absolute ramp. It gives you no forces. The best part of that drop is the view. It's really impressive that a ride that opened 10 years later after Silver Bullet has a drop that's just spectacular. It's honestly a highlight of the ride, which is fantastic, especially if you are in the right seat, because that whip is just, man. The drop sends you down into the first inversion, which is a dive loop. This inversion is really fun. You get an upside down view of the Kings Island Midway, which is super nice. This is honestly one of the more forgettable inversions on Banshee, because some of the other ones are just incredible. So this one just kind of happens, and then you're like, okay, what's next? So it's not a highlight, but it is really fun. It's not bad or anything. It doesn't hold back the ride at all. Right after that, Banshee throws you into the first vertical loop, which wraps around the lift hill, as I mentioned. This one's really fun. It's not my favorite loop if we look at the element itself and disassociate it from the cool gimmick of wrapping around the lift hill. The loop itself is it's alright. My favorite loops on B&M inverts they're generally shorter. When a loop is shorter, it has a more defined peak. It has a more defined apex. So when you're on the ride, you can feel when you reach that point, and when you hit that point on a B&M invert, it feels like you're kicking the sky. Like it kind of like pushes you out a little and then pulls you back in. So you can feel when you hit the top. The loop on Banshee, this actually applies to both loops. Both the loops on Banshee are so big that the tops are rounded, so you don't have that point where you're kicking the sky, which is my favorite part. So that's a little disappointing. That is the downside of a mega-sized invert like Banshee, but it's still a really solid moment. And again, the fact that it wraps around the lift hill is just so cool that I kind of give it a pass. That's also another positive of the dive loop. I really like how Banshee has an element in between the drop and the inversion that goes around the lift hill. Rides like Riddler's Revenge and Kumba that just go straight from drop to inversion around the lift hill. It kind of feels like cheating, you know, if that makes any sense. Like Banshee actually has an element to line itself up for that moment. Either way, after that loop, you go straight into the 0G roll. This 0G roll is huge, and you're way off the ground, which is really cool, especially for night rides. I've gotten a couple night rides on Banshee over the years. That was always my favorite visual, especially because it had like purple lights on the supports over there, which is just beautiful. Something that stands out to me about this 0G roll is the fact that it twists right. That felt pretty strange for me because I'm so used to Silver Bullet, and that 0G roll twists left. It felt kind of unnatural on my first ride on Banshee when it twisted me right instead of left, because that was just what I was used to at the time. Now that I've been on a few more B&M inverts, it feels like turning left is the more common 0G roll, but it still felt really bizarre, and I think that's worth noting. The next inversion, or the next two inversions, I guess, make up the pretzel knot on Banshee, and this is by far the most intense part of the ride, which is super cool. Also, apparently it's also where you reach your max speed at the bottom of the pretzel loop, and that's really cool, and it really speaks to the terrain usage of Banshee. It's kind of hard to comprehend that while you're on the ride, but the fact that you're reaching such a high point of intensity, like halfway through the ride, that's really impressive. It's also really cool how the inversions are super tall and super graceful, and then that valley in between the two inversions is like really intense. It's also where the rattle is the worst. Banshee does have a slight rattle. I've heard a lot of bad things about Banshee, but from my experience, it wasn't that bad at all. Like, it was almost completely eliminated in the front row, and in the back row, it was just kind of fine. I don't know if I've gotten incredibly lucky or if some of the complaints about Banshee have just been exaggerated, but from my experience, Banshee has not been bad at all. When I wrote it in 2021, one of my notes said that I compared it to Silver Bullet. Like, it's the same smoothness, it's the same roughness. Like, from my experience, I don't know if I've been on a glass smooth B&M invert. Most of them have a slight jitter at best and like a rattle at worst. In terms of roughness, I don't think anything in particular applies to Banshee, at least from my experience. After the pretzel knot, which is definitely a highlight of the ride, you are thrown into the second vertical loop, which is huge for a second loop. Oh my gosh, that thing is massive. I wouldn't be surprised if it's bigger than the first vertical loop on Silver Bullet, which really speaks to the scale of Banshee. But because of that scale, the same kick the sky thing is missing, so that is a little disappointing. Even on the second loop, it's too big. But that's kind of a flex, honestly, so that's pretty cool. Right after that, you're thrown into an upward helix, which is super, super intense. That's a really great gray out moment. I would say that and the bottom of the pretzel knot are the two most intense portions of the ride. Once you reach the top of the helix, you are thrown into my favorite element of the attraction, which is the inline twist. This is the best negative G's on the ride. You get some pretty sweet hang time, which is really sick. It's such a slow moving roll, and it's kind of surreal, and you're also really high off the ground too, so that was a little intimidating, but it's a super fun element, and it's my personal favorite part of Banshee. Right after that, you're thrown into the final helix, and then you hit the brakes. The final helix is actually pretty intense. You get some nice G's there. So that final sequence on Banshee is so impressive. I love it so much. It really ends with a bang because you have high positive G's, and then you have some crazy negatives during the inline twist. And you'd think after such an extreme moment of negative G's like that, because you're moving so slowly, it's really impressive that it has the speed to throw some really hard positive G's right back at you right before you hit the brakes. It's like that sequence of events between the two helixes is just spectacular, and I don't think that any other invert I've ever ridden has a sequence that compares to that. It's just mind-blowing. The variety of forces in those three elements are just so impressive. It's so cool. It's such a great way to end the attraction. And then the brake run is really long, which is kind of funny. So there's that. One thing I didn't talk about was the station and the overall aesthetic of the ride. I really love the gothic theming. The station is super nice. It might be my favorite station in the park, honestly. It's super tall. It's like kind of church themed, which is super interesting. I love the Son of Beast gravestone at the entrance to the attraction. I love that it ties into the park's history. I think that's super cool. Also, the entrance sign is just spectacular. It might be the greatest roller coaster sign of all time, which says a lot. That thing is so cool. It has mist too, so that adds to that aesthetic. Also, the color scheme on Banshee is beautiful. I think it might be my favorite color scheme in the park. I really love the purple and blue. It looks super nice. Even in age, it looks great. I think Orion's looks really good too, even though Orion's is pretty basic. And I feel like Orion has an unfair advantage because it is the newest coaster in the park, so the paint really pops. Banshee's looks great, even after years and years of operation. I haven't seen Diamondback with its new colors yet, but when I was last there, it was pretty faded. So I'm glad Kings Island has been taking care of their coasters because I love them all. They're all fantastic, including Banshee. Banshee is great. One of the most unique things about Banshee is the vest restraints. Every other B&M invert that I've been on has the classic over-the-shoulder restraints, so it's kind of interesting that my favorite one has the vest restraints. I don't think they took away from the ride at all. I thought they were super comfortable. Obviously, you can't get any headbanging on Banshee with those restraints, and I don't think it took away from the forces at all. I always thought that it was a super comfortable restraint. I never related to any of the complaints in regards to the vest restraints. I think they're awesome. But visually, I think it is a little funny how big the trains are on Banshee because the vest restraints really stick out compared to older B&M inverts, which are sleeker, which is very strange. So the trains on Banshee, even though they are comfortable, they do look a little strange. But yeah, all of that combines for my favorite B&M inverted coaster. As of now, its closest competition is in the same state up north at Cedar Point, but as of now, I have Banshee ranked ahead of Raptor as the king of B&M inverts. I am yet to get on Montu, so hopefully one day we can see if that dethrones it for me. As for its ranking in the park, I have Banshee ranked 4th behind Diamondback, Orion, and Mystic Timbers. And really, that's just because of my preferences. I prefer rides that have airtime. Banshee is a fantastic inversion machine. It's one of my favorite inversion machines that I've ever been on, and it's still 4th at Kings Island, which really speaks to the quality of that coaster collection. Diamondback, Orion, and Mystic just have spectacular airtime moments, and that really caters to my tastes. So unfortunately, Banshee does place behind those, but it is still an incredible attraction. It has an incredible theme. I love the colors, and all the forces are just mind-blowing. It is one of my favorite inversion machines, but inversion machines can only rank so highly for me. So my first experience with Mystic Timbers was in 2018 during my first visit to Kings Island. Back then, I was scared of roller coasters, but I didn't have a problem riding Mystic Timbers because I live very close to Ghost Rider, and I had been riding Ghost Rider for a while at that point. Mystic Timbers is very similar to Ghost Rider in terms of forces and train design and height, speed, etc. So I didn't have a problem riding Mystic Timbers in 2018. Back then, I did not hold up roller coaster restraints, so when I got to come back to Kings Island in 2021, I was very excited to ride Mystic Timbers because at that point I learned how to ride Ghost Rider properly to feel that airtime. So I was really, really excited to try to feel airtime on Mystic Timbers by holding up a restraint. Presentation of Mystic Timbers is spectacular. It's much more well themed than most coasters at Kings Island, certainly more than Diamondback, Banshee, and Beast. It's very well done. I do think the name is kind of dumb. It's kind of lame. They could have thought of a much cooler name to fit into the echelon of legendary roller coaster names at Kings Island, like Banshee, Beast, and Diamondback, but you know, that's kind of nitpicky. Mystic Timbers is fine. It's passable, you know. The logo is okay too. It definitely could be better. In terms of train design, it is just like Ghost Riders, so I am very familiar with it. It is annoying that you have to hold up the restraints to enjoy the airtime, but you know, it's not that hard. It could be a lot worse, so generally I like Millennium Flyer trains. These are pretty good. Once you get rolling out of the station, I really like the audio that plays on the lift hill. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of funny, and I like how it tries to tell a story, even though it's pretty loose. I like that noise that it makes, that alarm blaring. I don't even know what it's supposed to be, that blaring sound of the radio when right before the train crests the first drop. It's a great signifier, like, all right, we're about to get going, you know. Like, you can hear it all around the area too, so it's pretty cool. The first drop on Mystic Timbers is pretty weak. I mean, that's not that big of a deal. Ghost Rider's first drop is also pretty weak. I feel like I like Mystic Timbers better because the laterals at the bottom are pretty strong. After that, you pop up, then you go back over the lift hill. Dropping off of that moment is actually one of my favorite parts of that ride. It's a very solid airtime moment, especially on the back. After that, you have a straight airtime hill. It's basically a camelback. That's another one of my favorite moments. It's pretty hard to outline or define a standout moment for Mystic Timbers because to some degree it almost feels like after you cross over the lift hill, it's just one insane moment. You know, like the elements kind of blend together, which is pretty cool. I do like roller coasters that do that, so it's kind of interesting that that Kings Island has variety like that. Like the big B&M machines, Diamondback and Orion, have clearly defined elements where you can see where each element begins and ends, and Mystic Timbers kind of blends them all together, especially as you reach the end of the attraction, which we will get to later. After that really solid airtime moment with the camelback, you hit a couple lateral movements. These were pretty inconsistent, I'm not gonna lie. When I first rode Mystic Timbers on my 2021 trip, I wasn't that impressed with them, but I got a few night rides a couple days into my trip, and oh my gosh, dude. Those elements are spectacular when Mystic Timbers is hauling. Wow. It was like a world of difference. When it wasn't hauling, you didn't really get airtime. It was just lateral elements, which are fine, you know. It's just kind of filler almost. But when it was hauling, it was like it threw me out of my seat and then threw me to the side all in like one motion, and it does it back to back, which was just spectacular. So when Mystic Timbers is hauling, that's like one of the best parts of the ride. It's insane. After those night rides I got on Mystic Timbers, I legitimately thought about ranking it over Orion, which says a lot about the quality of Mystic Timbers. It's literally a third of its height. It gives Orion a good fight, you know. Despite the title of the video and despite my preference for graceful airtime, I love Mystic Timbers. This thing is awesome. And when the ride is hauling, those elements are just insane. And that might be peak Mystic Timbers. Those two elements, those twisting, I don't even know what to call them. They're like twisted airtime. They're not really airtime hills. They just kind of level out and turn, and then I don't know. But I don't want to look up the name. I don't care what the park calls it. Either way, it's a spectacular moment only when the ride is hauling, though, which is that asterisk is kind of annoying. I feel like that's why I rank Orion over Mystic Timbers, but you know, we'll get into that later. After those two moments, you hit the turnaround of Mystic Timbers. It's kind of fine. You know, the tunnel is cool, but on some of my rides, it feels like it slows down for a second on the turnaround. I don't know if that's an illusion or what. I feel the same about Apocalypse at Magic Mountain, that the turn under the drop on that ride, you crawl for no reason. But you know, once you come out of the turnaround, things kick back into gear. You have a couple of straight airtime moments without any twists. So I love those moments. They're really solid pops of airtime. After that, you bank right, you get another solid pop, and then you bank left to line up with the track that was coming out. You're like right next to the previous track, and you dive down. You hit a couple bunny hops that are twisted or banked They're not really, yeah, they're just banked. They're not twisted, and then you pop up into the brakes. So Mystic Timbers does feel kind of short, in my opinion. It's not that short. It feels like a complete ride experience, which is why I think it is an elite coaster, and it's it's a big reason why I love Kings Island so much, because their top tier rides are just insane. But I love this ride. It's very good. I feel like if I didn't live so close to Ghost Rider, I feel like I might like Mystic Timbers more, because I'm very spoiled with Ghost Rider. I ride that thing so much. So my standards for wooden coasters might be a little inflated. So that might be why I don't like Mystic Timbers as much as some people. But, you know, I still really love this. It is it's a spectacular ride experience, especially when it's hauling. Oh my gosh. I remember it like shot up my rankings after I got those night rides. Even the next day, on the 4th of July 2021, which was my marathon day at Kings Island, I think I got 12 rides on Mystic Timbers, and I loved all of them. One of my notes I wrote for that day, it literally says, I liked the ride more as I kept riding it. So the more it speeds up, the more you'll probably like Mystic Timbers. At least that's the case for me. I love the thing. It's so well done. It's just not on the level of Ghost Rider, in my opinion. The fact that it is a little moody does kind of drag it down, because I remember when I first rode it in 2021, just in the day, I put it in the same tier as Prowler and Renegade, and just now I'd probably put it in the same tier as Ghost Rider, even though it is below Ghost Rider. It is a spectacular roller coaster, and I don't blame people who love it. I just think it's so funny that people choose to draw standards for length for rides that they just don't like. Sometimes I feel like people just make up excuses to hate on Orion, instead of just saying it's not their type of ride. Because Mystic Timbers is not that long, dude. And I feel like people should recognize that more. But, you know, it is a spectacular coaster, and it ranks very highly for me. I love Mystic Timbers. It is amazing. In terms of seat preference, I think Mystic Timbers is by far a back row ride. It is really fun in the front, but just like Orion and Diamondback, you just can't beat a back row ride, especially at night when it's hauling, as I've discussed. It is incredible. It's on another level. I guess I'm just a backseat rider. But Mystic Timbers is amazing in the back row. You gotta ride it in the back, at least once. The front is fun. It's not as memorable as the back, you know. I tried to ride all of Kings Island's elite coasters in the front row just to compare it. I feel like the airtime moments on Mystic Timbers are best in the back row. As for the shed, I think it's fine. You know, it's something to look at. In 2018, my favorite part of the shed was the radio that like lit up and played music. But when I went back in 2021, it wasn't working, which was kind of disappointing. I don't know if it has been fixed since then. It has been 2 years, but you know, I have not been back to the park. So the screen is fine. You know, it's a little cheesy. It's kind of like, all right, Kings Island, you're not Disney, you're not Universal. I don't know what this was. The variations and the animations are interesting, though. It's like something to think about while you're on the brake run or while you're turning into the station. It's just kind of bizarre that is your grand escape. This has been talked about to death, but you know, it's part of the Mystic Timbers experience, which it's a little bizarre, you know. It's cool. I like it. If I had to outline my biggest problems with Mystic Timbers, I feel like the consistency of the twisted banks, that kind of bugs me. If it ran as well as it did at the end of the night, like all the time, Mystic Timbers might be my second favorite ride at Kings Island. It's pretty close, Mystic Timbers and Orion. I just give the edge to Orion because of consistency. That's kind of a big deal to me. However, another issue that I have, it's kind of a nitpick, but I feel like the ending is kind of lame. I feel like that's some of the weakest hills on Mystic Timbers are at the end, where they're just so small that they don't pop you out of your seat that much. You know, they're just kind of there, and then you pop up into the brake run and you're like, oh, okay, we're done. I feel like it's missing like a final, I don't know. If you look at the other rides at Kings Island, I feel like Diamondback ends with a bang. I feel like Orion ends with a bang. Same with Banshee, even Beast with the Rose Bowl. And Mystic is just kind of, meh, you know, like the best parts of the ride already happened. So there's that. Either way, it is a nitpick. It's an incredible ride. I truly believe it is elite, even if I am sounding a little negative. This ride is absolutely spectacular, and you have to ride it in the back, preferably at night. It is an incredible GCI. It is my favorite GCI. It just does not reach the heights of Ghost Rider. I feel like I can bring a unique perspective to Orion, because unlike most people, Orion was my first Giga coaster. And since then, I've actually been on the other 3 American Gigas. It's been interesting to compare it from like a reverse perspective, in that I got to ride Orion first and then Millennium, Fury, and Intimidator afterwards. Jumping right into Orion, just like Diamondback, the presentation is spectacular, which I think is credit to Kings Island. It's a spectacular park, and it's very well run, and it makes sure that all of its rides are presented perfectly, especially its headliners like Orion and Diamondback. Orion's station is really nice, and it actually has a themed queue house, which is pretty rare for a regional theme park or a regional amusement park. It's not much, but it is pretty good. I feel that the name Orion and the logo are inferior to Diamondback, but the imposing structure of the ride itself and the superior integration into the themed land, which is Area 72, I feel like that makes up for it. So once again, the presentation is spectacular. For the ride itself, Orion has the same restraints as Diamondback, which I love. If you've watched my Diamondback review, you would know that. Clamshells are my absolute favorite restraints, and I'm so happy that my first Giga had them. I didn't notice any differences in terms of restraints, but however, I do prefer the freedom of the staggered seats on Diamondback and the longer trains. But you know, I can't complain about Orion. It's still a spectacular setup. The lift hill is very long. You have a great view of the surrounding area. It's also very quiet, which has been talked about. On my first ride on Orion, I was a little disappointed by the first drop, because I was expecting it to have stronger airtime than Diamondbacks, which I didn't feel it did. The more I rode it, the more it grew on me, and I later switched that opinion. But at first I wasn't that impressed with it. I mean, it's obvious that the duration of the drop and the sustained airtime is very impressive, but at first I wasn't the biggest fan of the drop. I have since changed that opinion. After getting multiple re-rides on Orion, I realized how spectacular and world class that drop is. It is amazing, don't get me wrong. After you kick things off with a bang with that first drop, the next 2 elements are pretty underwhelming, which is really disappointing. The wave turn is, it's okay. If you're in the far right seat on the wave turn, you might get some light floater. I remember getting that on most of my rides on the right seat. And in the left seat, you might get a tiny pop on the turnaround. But other than that, they kind of feel like wasted elements. It doesn't feel like they serve that much of a purpose. They're not that great at showcasing the speed of the ride, because they're so high off the ground, and they don't really have airtime. The airtime that it does have is very, very minimal. It's like if you'd have to be paying attention to notice the airtime, which I was, of course. The laterals on the turnaround are fine. It just doesn't feel like it had a purpose other than just filling out the layout, which is really disappointing, because it's been talked to death about how short of a ride experience Orion is. I don't really think it's that short, but when 2 of the elements are so underwhelming, that is the main problem with Orion, in my opinion. It's not necessarily the duration, it's just that the number of elements, which if you count them out, I count 7, 2 of them are useless, basically. The other 5 are spectacular, as we will discuss, but if the wave turn after the first drop was as well done as the treble clef on Fury, I feel like people would be complaining a lot less about Orion than they do. If Orion had sideways airtime on its first element after the drop, I feel like a lot more people would have walked away from Orion being more satisfied than they were. even with that lame turnaround, which is fine. You can have a lame turnaround on a ride. Diamondback is my favorite roller coaster of all time, and it has a pretty lame turnaround. I'd argue like even the turnaround on Orion is better than the turnaround on Diamondback, but it's still an underwhelming element. Moving on, after that you have the speed hill, which is just spectacular. Things switch right back into gear. I love the speed hill on Orion. It was my first speed hill on a coaster with clamshell restraints, so my first rides were in the back row, and just feeling how strong the airtime was before the crest, and then after the crest it getting even stronger is just spectacular. Kind of reminds me of Diamondback, how Diamondback does it, but it was a lot stronger. It was fast, it was incredible. I love that element. It's definitely one of the best in the park, if not the best. Speaking of Diamondback, the next element is a Diamondback style floater airtime hill. It does have a trim, but it does not bother me. I feel like the trim did not impact the airtime at all. It's a very solid element, and I love Diamondback, so getting a taste of Diamondback on Orion, I love it. I'll take it. Right after that, you go straight into the Helix, which is really fun. It definitely helps a lot with diversifying forces on Orion. Up to this point, the best parts of the ride were all airtime, and this is a really good part of the ride, which focuses on positive Gs. After that, you curve out, you go under the first drop, and then you curve up into the twisted dip. I know this element blew a lot of people away when Orion first opened. That wasn't too surprising to me because the profiling of that element reminds me a lot of the first element on Manta at SeaWorld San Diego. And if you've ridden Manta at SeaWorld San Diego in the back row, you know that is one of the best airtime moments on the ride. So seeing an element that's profiled just like it at the end of a Giga coaster, I was expecting a really solid airtime moment, and it did deliver, which is super great. I'm really glad that it does. It's kind of sad that it's more of a standout than the giant wave turn. That thing does kind of upset me by existing, because it has so much potential. It could have been one of the best moments of airtime on the ride, and it's just not. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it's not, because the treble clef is just spectacular. It's one of the best elements I've ever been on Fury 325. It's insane. But here at Kings Island, they got stuck with the wave turn, and it just did not deliver, which is kind of disappointing. It's a little frustrating, but I'm just coming back to the same point. Orion would have been so much more complete if it just had that moment of sideways airtime that just blew everyone away. I feel like it really, really would have tied the whole ride together, but it is what it is. After the twisted dip, you pop up into the brake run, and that concludes your ride experience. Overall, I love Orion. It was my first Giga coaster, and I like it more than a couple of them. A couple of the other Giga coasters, which I feel like might be an unpopular opinion. Orion is my type of ride. Even despite the two wasted elements, it is spectacular. It's an incredible ride experience. I love it so much. I rode it 12 times in one day at the end of my trip in 2021, and I love that ride, man. I really, really wish Southern California had a ride like Orion. It is spectacular. It has a great diversity of forces, and I love the airtime it delivers. That type of airtime, we just don't have it in Southern California, so maybe that's why I appreciate it so much. But either way, I love Orion. I love Diamondback. They both deliver. Despite my preference for Diamondback, I still love Orion. In terms of intensity, the two standout moments on this ride were the first valley, the bottom of the first drop. I did gray out on some of my rides, but not all of them. The same applies to the Helix towards the end of the ride. I grayed out on some of my rides, but not all of them. So for whatever reason, my gray outs on Orion were pretty inconsistent. I don't know if that had to do with my hydration levels at the time, or how it was running, but that was just my experience. In terms of rows, I feel Orion is by far a back row ride for that first drop, the twisted dip, and the camelback, but the front is still really good. The sense of speed and the wind in the front row of Gigas, it's spectacular. That's pretty well known, but I feel like it just can't meet the airtime of the back. The only element that might be better in the front row is the speed hill, but even then, it's not by much. It is still a spectacular moment and a standout moment in the back row. However, I actually like Orion better in the front row than I like Diamondback in the front row, so take that for what you will. In terms of ranking Orion's elements, my favorite is the first drop. It is spectacular, it's world class, and I really wish it was closer to my home so I could ride it more. My second favorite element is the speed hill. It's a spectacular moment of airtime. It's one of the best in the park, and I love it, you know. There's not that much to say. And then my third favorite is the twisted dip that reminds me of the first element of Manta. That it's profiled really well, and I love it so much. It's almost like a baby treble clef. That's kind of a stretch, but you know, it's a spectacular moment of airtime and a great way to end the attraction. So I love Orion, and the only way to improve it in my book would be to somehow make that first wave turn give sideways airtime. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it doesn't. I just wish it did, man. That seems to be the bottom line of this review. And that's why I prefer Diamondback over Orion. I mean, it's hard to say in a hypothetical alternate universe. If it did give a really solid pop of sideways airtime, maybe Orion would be my favorite coaster of all time. But it's not. I love Diamondback, and as I outlined in that review, it might be for sentimental reasons, but Orion comes in second at Kings Island for me. That's not really a knock against Orion. I love both of those rides. They're both spectacular, and I really think people need to pay attention to what Orion is and what it does well, and not compare it to Fury and staying low to the ground. And that is not my problem with Orion. I think you can still have a spectacular Giga Coaster without doing these low to the ground transitions like Fury and I-305. I actually prefer Orion to I-305, but you know, that's a discussion for another day. Right off the bat, the presentation of Diamondback is absolutely perfect. It's pretty flawless in terms of regional amusement parks. You can't get much better than Diamondback. I love how nice and clean the station is. It looks very well done. And I love the name too. Diamondback is a perfect name for a roller coaster. It's the type of name that belongs at Kings Island, who really names their rides really well. I'd consider Banshee and Beast also great roller coaster names. Some of their recent coasters need to work on that, but you know, Diamondback is one of the all-time great coaster names. Not only is the name perfect, but the logo is spectacular as well. So much so that I have a sweatshirt with the logo on it and a sticker on the back of my MacBook because I love this ride so much, and the logo and name are perfect. Diamondback also has a great setting as it goes back into the woods compared to other B&M hypers, which are right next to a parking lot or a street. But you know, that's an upside of Kings Island and its location. But it also plays in favor of Diamondback and the ride experience. Another key factor of Diamondback's excellent presentation is the splashdown. It's such a spectacle, and off-ride I could watch it all day. It's mesmerizing to watch. Every time a train is coming, I had to stop and watch it every day I was at Kings Island. It's just such a spectacle, and I love watching it, and I really wish more coasters did a splashdown the way that Diamondback does it. For example, the Matterhorn at Disneyland, one of my home parks, has a splashdown on both sides of the attraction, and it's hidden behind a wall, which is kind of frustrating, but you know. On the other hand, Kings Island really put the splashdown front and center. The path goes all the way around it. You have a clear view from the queue, from the midways. It's just spectacular. It's very well done, and it looks super nice with the grass. And the way that the splashdown pool looks, it's just spectacular. It's so well done. As for the on-ride experience, the layout is pretty straightforward. It is a B&M hyper after all. You have the drop, you bank right, an airtime hill, then you bank left, another airtime hill, you hit the turnaround, you hit another airtime hill, then you hit a rising helix into the mid-course brake run. You drop off of that, you go with back-to-back airtime hills, and then you hit a helix, and then you hit the final splashdown. So it's pretty straightforward, but the ride is so much more than that. Right off the bat, the trains and the restraints are perfect. They are by far some of my favorite restraints of all time. The clamshell restraints are so comfortable, and they don't come down on you, so you can actually enjoy the ride and focus on the ride and not holding up your restraint, which is frustrating for other attractions like Mystic Timbers when you have to put effort into holding up your restraint. And especially with every RMC out there, it's so annoying dealing with those restraints. But on B&M Hypers, it is not an issue, and Diamondback is no exception. As for the ride itself, I'm going to go through the experience in the front row first, then the middle, and then the back. So in the front row, Diamondback is solid. It's not the greatest coaster of all time, but it's super fun. In the front row, obviously, the first drop doesn't give you much. A little bit of floater, but not incredible. The first two airtime hills give you very strong airtime cresting into the airtime hill, but once you hit that midpoint, the airtime just kind of dies, which is a little lame, but it is really impressive how much force it throws you up into the air in the first half of both of those camelbacks. The turnaround is fine. It's the similar deal with the third camelback, but the problem with the third camelback with the trim is fine. It's never bothered me in any row, but the valley right before it is rather shaky, which could be an issue. It doesn't bother me at all, but it's there. So if you're the type of person who is sensitive to a rattle, then that is by far the worst part of Diamondback. It's pretty shaky. After that third airtime hill, you curve up into the mid-course brake run. In the front row, you get some solid positive Gs, and of course, that's where you get your on-ride picture. After the mid-course brake run, you drop off. Again, you wouldn't get much in the front because it's a drop. The following two airtime hills are okay in the front. They're not as good as the first three. After that is the helix, which is fine. You get a nice view of the midway down below and the beast's entrance. And then you drop down into the splashdown, which is super nice in the front because it feels like you're gliding, because you are gliding along the water. And there's no one behind you, so it looks like it's just you, which is a pretty nice visual. You can really say that about every coaster, though. The visuals in the front row will always be the best. The wind in your face and all that. That's always a spectacular sensation, which is why it's always nice to get a front row ride on any coaster, including Diamondback. The middle rows differ from my experience in a little bit in terms of the airtime hills. For example, the first two airtime hills in the middle, I have vivid memories of being absolutely blown away by how long I was out of my seat in the middle rows. I don't think it was the most sustained force, but it was just the duration of it was incredible because you float out of your seat before the crest, and unlike the front row, you stay out of your seat afterwards as you fall back down. The problem with the middle rows, though, is that for the last two airtime hills after the mid-course brake run, it's kind of dead. You don't get that much airtime, if any, which is pretty lame, especially on a B&M Hyper. But I excuse it because the back row on Diamondback, it is just absolutely insane. I love the back row on Diamondback so much. It is absolutely a back row ride. If you are ever at Kings Island, you need to ride Diamondback in the back row. It is spectacular. The first drop is obviously amazing. You get a really strong pop as you crest down, and then you keep floating out of your seat until it levels out. It's just, the profiling on B&M Hyper drops is just spectacular. I love watching it as it gets steeper and steeper before it bottoms out. It's just so impressive, and when you're in the back you can really see it because you can see all the riders slowly go under themselves right before pulling out. It's so cool. First two big airtime hills, oh my gosh, man, you begin floating out of your seat before the crest. It's a really strong airtime moment, like before you even crest the hill. It's spectacular, and then you crest it and you just absolutely, you get thrown. It's incredible. It's hard to describe. It's like a euphoric feeling because you're already floating and then it just throws you even harder while you're in the air. It's spectacular. And you don't have to do it once, you do it twice, like back to back. It's just insane, and I love it so much. I love that feeling. The turnaround is really the only dead spot on Diamondback in the back row, which is fine. It's a turnaround. A lot of coasters have them, but you get a similar sensation of euphoric airtime on the third airtime hill. It's not as pronounced, and you do have to deal with that rattle, which again does not bother me. And of course the trim, which did not impact my rides like at all. I've heard a lot of complaining about trims on B&M Hyper coasters, including Orion, Fury, and Intimidator, and they've never bothered me. I'm not sure if I've gotten incredibly lucky or if I'm just immune to that, but I feel like that hill still gives you very strong airtime. And once again, the curve up into the mid-course brake run gives you really solid positive Gs, which really helps Diamondback in terms of diversity of forces. It's just incredible. For the drop off the mid-course brake run, you get another solid pop. The mid-course might slow you down a little. It doesn't bother me. Again, it might sound like I'm making a lot of excuses for this ride, but it truly does not bother me. It's another fantastic airtime moment dropping off the mid-course brake run. So, I'll take it. The next two airtime hills are basically smaller versions of the first three, but they're still very solid moments, and I love them. They're honestly better airtime moments than the best airtime moment on a majority of coasters. So I love these hills. The final helix is really nice because it lines you up for the drop into the splashdown, and I am telling you, the drop into the splashdown in the back row of Diamondback is by far one of the most underrated airtime moments I've ever been on. It is absolutely spectacular. It has the strength of the first two hills, but it's in a shorter time frame because the drop is a lot shorter. It's basically like a smaller drop off the mid-course brake run, but it throws you. It's an awesome feeling. And then when you actually land, you land in the splashdown, and if you're in the back row, you can actually reach back and touch the water, and I've done that so many times. Oh my gosh, man, it's legitimately magical. I love Diamondback in the back row. It is absolutely incredible. You have to do it in the back row. I am telling you, do not miss out on Diamondback in the back row when you go to Kings Island. So I've been through the ride experience. I've explained what I love about it so much. I understand it's not everyone's cup of tea. It is very repetitive, but I love that floating airtime sensation. I love how it throws you twice, basically. It throws you a second time while you're in mid-air when you're in the back row. It's just spectacular, and I love that it focuses on it and it does it over and over again. And in my opinion, it really stands out from other B&M hypers who kind of lose their way. For example, Mako. I don't want to dig too deep into this comparison because I really want to focus on how incredible Diamondback at Kings Island is. But Mako kind of dies after the mid-course brake run. There's only one solid airtime moment. Diamondback has four, and in my opinion, the best airtime moment is the last one, which just blows my mind. It's spectacular. I love that drop into the splashdown so much. It's so underrated. I'm telling you, pay attention to that drop the next time you ride Diamondback. It just throws you, and it's so powerful, and it's spectacular. I love the ride experience on Diamondback, but I also love Diamondback for sentimental reasons. I'm just going to go through a few of my favorite Diamondback memories. I got to ride the attraction for the first time in the summer of 2018. And then in 2021, I went back to Kings Island and I got to ride it more. So my first ever ride in 2018, I was terrified of the thing. I was still afraid of coasters back then, and Diamondback was actually my first coaster over 200 feet. So I'll forever love this ride just for that fact, that it was a major milestone in getting over my fear of roller coasters. And for that alone, it will always have a special place in my heart. After my first ride, I lapped the thing. I loved it so much. It was my favorite coaster back then. So when I went back in 2021, I was super nervous. I was like, this was my first coaster like Diamondback. And at that point, I had been on other coasters that focus on floater airtime like Mako and Steel Eel. So I was a little nervous that Diamondback was going to be like average or below average when comparing it to my memory of it in 2018 and my more recent experience on those other coasters. But my first ride in 2021, it still met those expectations, which was a spectacular accomplishment because I was so nervous, but it did it. It's a spectacular ride. And then a few days later, on July 3rd, 2021, I got to ride Diamondback during the park's fireworks show, and that was one of the most spectacular rides on any attraction I've ever been on in my entire life. After that ride, I wrote some notes, and I described it as pure magic or literally magic. It was absolutely amazing. The airtime was so powerful, and maybe it's because I was distracted. I was watching the fireworks instead of the layout, but it's one of the best coaster experiences I've ever had. And as a theme park fan, as the theme park nerd, I live I live for experiences like that, and Diamondback gave me one of the best ever, and it was incredible. It was magical. It was amazing, and I love it so much. After that ride, the fireworks were still going off. When I got off the ride, the park was closed, so I couldn't go again. So I was just watching the fireworks, and I almost teared up. I was on the verge of tears as God Bless the USA was playing, and that was just a ride experience I'm never gonna forget. It was absolutely perfect, and I love everything about it. The next day, I came back on July 4th, 2021. I had Fastlane that day, and I rode Diamondback 15 times. 15 times in one day, and I loved every single ride. Towards the end of the night, I did get a ride where fireworks, not shot off by the park, but by local residents, they were going off all around the park. It made like a perimeter around the park. I'll never forget that image, going up the lift hill during sunset and seeing fireworks just sprinkled around the park. It's just beautiful, and and getting to ride it like that was just wow. So yeah, I've only ridden Diamondback in 2 different years, and in both years it gave me some spectacular memories, and I'm super excited for the next time I get to ride Diamondback, whether that's in 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. I don't care. I love this ride. This ride will always have a special place in my heart, and it is my number 1 overall. I love Diamondback so much, and I do not care what anyone else says. Diamondback is absolutely spectacular, and you need to ride it. You have to ride it. I love Diamondback. Please go ride Diamondback at Kings Island. Thank you.